Normally I don't do disclaimers, but this episode I felt like I needed to add a disclaimer. This episode talks about suicide. If this topic makes you feel uncomfortable or uneasy, you may want to skip this episode. The opinions mentioned in this podcast don't reflect those of the Campfire Crime Chronicles. Viewer discretion is advised. Before we get into the case tonight, I want to thank the show's sponsor, BetterHelp, for helping keep the flame lit of the campfire for this episode. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy service that's 100% online. So you don't have that awkwardness of sitting in a waiting room with a whole bunch of other strangers waiting to see your therapist. With BetterHelp, you have access to a network of over 25,000 licensed and experienced therapists who can help you with whatever you're dealing with. All you have to do to get started is answer some questions about what your needs and preferences are in therapy. So that way, BetterHelp can match you with a therapist that is right for you. And if you want to change your therapist because maybe you're not comfortable with them, you can change your therapist at any time for no additional charge. You also don't have to wait any specific time or any number of sessions to change your therapist. So when you match up with that right therapist, you can talk to your therapist however is most comfortable for you, whether it's text, chat, phone, or video. You can also message your therapist at any time and schedule live sessions when it's convenient for you and your schedule. With BetterHelp, you get the same professionalism and quality you expect from in-office therapy, but with a therapist who is custom-picked for you, with more scheduling flexibility and more affordable prices. So if you go to the website and use the show's code, betterhelp.com/CCC, not only does that let them know that you heard it at the campfire, but you'll also receive 10% off your first month. So that's betterhelp.com/CCC, betterhelp, HELP.com/CCC. And I'll also have a link provided in the show notes. Good evening, everyone. This intro is a little bit different, mainly because everyone knows or has heard about the Michele Carter case. I've learned a lot of people's opinions researching this case, which, if you want to search those opinions, you can. I will probably talk about them on a bonus episode over in the bonfire. In this episode of the campfire, I'm going to talk about the backgrounds of both Conrad and Michele, of what I was able to find, and go over the text messages that led to Conrad taking his own life. And then we will also talk about the court proceedings, trial, and sentencing of Michele, as well as her release date. Welcome to the campfire. Grab your s'mores and grab a seat. Thanks for joining me tonight around the fire, where we discuss the dark world of true crime. This is the Campfire Crime Chronicles, a true crime podcast. And this is the case of Conrad Roy III. Conrad Roy III was born September 12, 1995 in New Bedford at St. Luke's Hospital. He lived with his family in Mattapoisett, Massachusetts. Conrad had a lot going for him through high school. He worked with his father, uncle, and grandfather at the family's business, Tucker Roy Marine Towing and Salvage. In the spring of 2014, he would receive his charter boat captain's license from Northeast Maritime Institute by completing a 3-month boating course. Conrad graduated from high school in June of 2014 on the honor roll from Old Rochester Regional High School, or OPR, in Mattapoisett, with a 3.88 GPA. He was also an athletic person who was on the road crew, played basketball, and also ran track. Conrad would be accepted into Fitchburg State University to study business. However, he would never attend his first semester. From a young age, Conrad Roy, who was the grandfather of Conrad Roy III, and Conrad's father, who was Conrad Roy Jr., would take Conrad on the boats as well as some of their jobs. He would grow up being on the water, and boating would become part of his life, as he would either be one of the family's business boats, or for pleasure. When Conrad received his captain's license, he was excited to show his family, including his grandfather. While being a successful teen and being accepted into college, Conrad struggled a lot with mental health. He would experience anxiety, social anxiety, and depression at the age of 16. It would be reported that the onset of the depression would occur around the time his parents would divorce, which was said and interpreted as both messy and violent. Conrad would see several therapists to help him deal with his depression and anxiety. It would be said that he would express to the therapist that he wanted to die. The Roys were blue-collar workers. Conrad Jr. II, Conrad's father, with his marine towing and salvage company, helped tow the U.S. Airways Flight 1549 to shore from the Hudson River. Conrad would get suspended from school for fighting. There's no physical proof or witnesses that this was reported. This was an accusation. While suspended, though, Conrad went to see someone who he was close to at Fitchburg State. Although they were close, the relationship followed a thin line in that they were teammates in basketball and would play Madden together. This would end up being a bust and would text Lynn that he wasn't sleeping well. He would follow up with texting her, "I'm feeling anxious and I'm feeling down, and I don't know why. I just can't be normal." He would text another friend or long-distance girlfriend, however you want to look at it, Michele Carter. At this point, they have already met and were already texting each other. And he would text Michele saying, quote, "I wasn't comfortable and I'm feeling depressed again, and it feels like everything switched around," end quote. Michele Carter was born August 11, 1996, and lived in Plainfield, Massachusetts. Michelle's parents had white-collar jobs. Her father was the son of a bank vice president who was the sales manager for a forklift supplier. Her mother, Gail, would stage interiors for real estate agents. Michele, much like Conrad, had her own issues of mental health that she was dealing with. She had issues with self-image like many teenagers do, and would have problems with anorexia. It was also said that she had the need to feel important and loved by friends and family. She struggled a lot with friends. With the few friends that she did have in school, she would barely see them outside of school and during the summer. If Michele sent out text message to one of her friends and they didn't respond immediately, she would continue to blow up their phones until they would respond. Prior to the school year, Michele was on a traveling softball team and was on a trip to Montreal. She would have gotten close to one of the girls on the team from Bellingham, who was Alice Felsman. They would become inseparable, and while the rest of the team would go out to eat, just the two of them would have dinner together. When they would return from Montreal, Michele would spend the night at Alice's house at least once a week. They would go get into activities together, such as walks or swimming in Michele's pool. They would also sneak out at 3 a.m. to go play basketball. It was looking like Michele found a great friend in Alice, and things were going to be good for Michele. Then, out of nowhere, Alice stopped responding to Michele's text messages, completely ghosting her. Michele would tell Conrad about Alice ghosting her, and it would make her feel depressed. Conrad would comfort her by telling her to not let it get to her or bring her down. Then the topic of conversation changed from talking about having sex to Conrad telling Michele that he would run away and move to California next fall alone. So they go talking about Alice ghosting Michele to talking about sex to talking about Conrad up and moving to California by himself and not taking Michele or anybody with him. So Michele, feeling like Conrad was going to leave her too and she was going to be all alone in Massachusetts, tells Conrad that she would go with him and that they would be happy together, changing their lives, being out in California together. So now we're going to get into how the two met. Michele and Conrad would meet in Florida in 2012 while both of them were visiting family. Michele and Conrad lived between 47 and 48 miles from each other in Massachusetts. However, they would still seldomly see each other. They mostly communicated through text, emails, and phone calls. Conrad's parents would say that the relationship between Conrad and Michele were mostly through text messages. They would only have met about 3 to 5 times, with living only about an hour from each other. According to reports, Conrad would attempt suicide a total of 4 times prior to being successful. The first time would be he would attempt to take his own life with an OD of over-the-counter medicine of Tylenol or aspirin or Advil. When this happened, he was talking to his friend Ariana, where she would then immediately call Lynn, Conrad's mother, and they would call the police, and an ambulance would respond immediately to take Conrad to the hospital where his life would be saved. While the other 3 attempts aren't very well known, he would frequently look up online the most effective ways to commit suicide. Conrad would talk to Michele during these attempts and contemplations of suicide, where she would talk him down. The summer of 2014, Michele would go to McLean Hospital in Belmont for treatment for her anorexia. While she was there, she would try and talk Conrad into going to the hospital to get some professional help as well that could help him with his issues and why he would feel the way he was feeling. However, Conrad would not take Michele up on that, and 3 weeks later tell her that he was suicidal. So in one conversation that Conrad and Michele had with each other was the topic of being Romeo and Juliet, where they're together in death. Although Michele would state that she would love to be his Juliet, she would add that neither of them would be dying. About a month prior to Conrad's death, he would make a couple of different video diaries. In his diaries, it would give viewers a look into what Conrad was thinking, feeling, and going through, and the video goes through explicit details and thoughts of his anxiety. He also mentions in the videos about the same time all of his accomplishments and everything that he has going for him in life. So I'm not going to talk about the videos now. I'm going to wait and play them in a bonus episode over at the bonfire. But after watching the videos, you could see in his eyes and expressions at times there seemed to be something bothering him. But then he would almost talk himself out of it being down and bring himself back up whenever he was talking about the future and his goals that he had for himself. He talked about everything that has gone well for him and his achievements that he's made, and that he looked forward to the future and what it was going to bring. In the weeks leading up to Conrad's suicide, Michele and Conrad's texts would change from conversations to her pushing him and drilling him toward suicide. The day before leading up to Conrad's death, Conrad spent the day with his mother and took his sisters out for ice cream. This behavior is not unfamiliar either, as someone who has experienced others that have committed suicide and talking with their friends and family, I have been told and seen that when someone is getting ready to take their own life, they will often spend their final moments or days with the people closest to him. The night that Conrad killed himself, he told his mother Lynn that he was going to Ariana's house and said goodbye. Michele and Conrad had exchanged over 60,000 text messages. At the time of Conrad's death, he was 18 years old and Michele was 17. The day that Conrad died, Michele was on the phone with Conrad, and Michele would confess to one of her friends, Samantha, that Michele was on the phone with Conrad, who got out of the truck and saying that he was scared and didn't want to abandon his family. Then Michele tells Conrad to get back into the truck, and on the night of July 12, 2014, when Michele told Conrad to get back in the truck, she would listen to him choke on the gases from the water pump that was in the backseat of the truck with the windows closed. So this next part, there's only one source that mentioned this, and I wasn't able to verify its authenticity of it, so take it as you will. While Michele was on the phone with Conrad, she texted his sister, Camden, asking if she heard or knew where Conrad was. She would ask her mother about it, and they responded to Michele that he was at his father's. So the next morning, Lynn had texted Conrad earlier in the morning. Then later that morning, she calls the police to report him missing because she has not heard from him. An alert would go out to all police units about Conrad missing and the description of his truck. When the police were searching for Conrad and his truck, which was a black Ford F-250 diesel, they would find Conrad in his truck in the Kmart parking lot located in Fairhaven, Massachusetts. Conrad would already have died at this point, and police would find his cell phone. Investigators saw the setup of the water pump and realized that it was an apparent suicide. At the time, police almost dismissed the phone of being any importance, but thought it might have answers of why an 18-year-old would take his own life. In Massachusetts, all unknown deaths are worked and investigated. Weeks after Conrad dies, Michele is still texting Conrad's phone, and these messages are obviously going to be one-sided text messages. Fairhaven police detectives Scott Gordon and Glenn Codd investigated Roy's death. When they were able to charge the phone and unlock it, they saw the last message thread was to Michele Carter. 2.5 months would go by since Conrad would die. Michele hosts a fundraiser for suicide awareness in her town called Homers for Conrad. There she was seen laughing and talking with friends and being in what some would call in an upbeat mood. There was an undercover detective there, and the problem they had was that Michele's phone was registered to her mother, and they wanted to prove that Michele was on the phone or using the phone that was texting Conrad. So while videotaping Michele, they call Michele's phone to prove that she's the one answering when they call. So now that they figured out who Michele Carter is and that she was the one on the other end of the phone sending messages to Conrad, detectives would locate Michele at her high school and would meet with her for an interview and would have a search warrant to obtain her phone. I want to thank the show's sponsor, BetterHelp, for helping keep the flame lit of the campfire for this episode. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy service that's 100% online. So you don't have that awkwardness of sitting in a waiting room with a whole bunch of other strangers waiting to see your therapist. With BetterHelp, you have access to a network of over 25,000 licensed and experienced therapists who can help you with whatever you're dealing with. All you have to do to get started is answer some questions about what your needs and preferences are in therapy. So that way, BetterHelp can match you with a therapist that is right for you. And if you want to change your therapist because maybe you're not comfortable with them, you can change your therapist at any time for no additional charge. You also don't have to wait any specific time or any number of sessions to change your therapist. So when you match up with that right therapist, you can talk to your therapist however is most comfortable for you, whether it's text, chat, phone, or video. You can also message your therapist at any time and schedule live sessions when it's convenient for you and your schedule. With BetterHelp, you get the same professionalism and quality you expect from in-office therapy, but with a therapist who is custom-picked for you, with more scheduling flexibility and more affordable prices. So if you go to the website and use the show's code, betterhelp.com/CCC, not only does that let them know that you heard it at the campfire, but you'll also receive 10% off your first month. So that's betterhelp.com/CCC. BetterHelp, HELP.com/CCC. And I'll also have a link provided in the show notes. So on October 2nd, 2014, at 5:51 p.m., detectives traveled to Michele Carter's high school in Rutland, Massachusetts, to interview her. At this point, they've read the text messages from Conrad's phone between Conrad and Michele and have a search warrant to take her phone for analysis. While speaking with her, they wanted to see if they would answer their questions honestly or if she knew what happened. She would seem to try and beat around the bush and not admit to anything knowing about Conrad's suicide. At this point, the detectives would tell her about the search warrant and take her phone. She was hesitant at first to openly give them her phone, and then that's when they would tell her that they had a search warrant to take the phone and retrieve the contents off of it. So now you're thinking, typical teenager doesn't want to lose her phone because she's connected to the world through her phone. But there are other reasons why Michele does not want detectives taking her phone, which we'll get into. So while detectives are going through Michele Carter's phone, they see the text messages from her to Conrad and the conversation they had. But they also find a conversation with Samantha that Michele confesses to Samantha about how Conrad got out of the truck and wasn't going to complete suicide, but she talks him into getting back into the truck and being on the phone with him until he dies. And that is what she did not want detectives finding, because now she thinks she's going to jail. Michele Carter would be indicted on February 4th of 2015 and then arraigned that following day in New Bedford Juvenile Court located in Taunton, Massachusetts. She was 17 at the time. The charges that she was facing could give her up to 20 years in prison. In June of 2015, the defense would file a motion to remove the Bristol County DA from the prosecution because he was the first cousin twice removed of Conrad's, and this motion would be denied. It wouldn't be until June of 2017 when Carter would go on trial for her part in assisting Conrad with suicide and talking him into doing it. The day before Carter was to go on trial, on the 5th of June, she would waive her right to a jury trial. Therefore, the case would be heard by Judge Lawrence Moniz. The text messages between Carter and Roy were used in court as their evidence. The text messages such as, "Just do it, babe," and another was telling Conrad to get back into the truck that was filled with monoxide gas, were the key messages in the prosecution's case. Then, while Conrad was choking on the poisonous gas, Michele did nothing while she listened to him suffocate, not even as so much to tell him to get out of the truck or call for help. The defense would argue that the text messages were protected by free speech rights. On June 16th of 2017, Moniz would talk about Carter's phone calls with Roy while he was gassing himself in his truck. While he was talking, it would seem that he would be clearing Carter of wrongdoing. But then Roy exited the vehicle, which he would essentially cut off the suicide attempt, and Carter would argue and tell Roy to get back into the truck, as described by Carter to her friends via text messages. With this, Moniz found Michele Carter guilty of involuntary manslaughter. Conrad's father would publicly state that him and his family were happy with the verdict from Moniz, and Lynn Roy would appear on 48 Hours, where she would say that Carter didn't have conscience and believed that she knew exactly what she was doing. Michele would remain free on bail until August 3rd of 2017 for her sentencing. She would be sentenced to 2.5 years, of which 15 months would be served at the Bristol County House of Corrections, while the balance would be suspended, and she would have 5 years probation following her release. Soon after the sentencing was handed down, Carter's lawyers asked Moniz to issue a stay of sentence until all of Carter's Massachusetts court's appeals options were exhausted. Moniz granted this stay with conditions that Carter stay away from the Roy family. On February 16th of 2019, Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court would rule that Carter had acted with criminal intent at the same time that she encouraged Conrad to commit suicide, and the involuntary manslaughter charge would stand as her sentence would be enforced, which began February 11th of 2019. Carter would have a parole hearing in September for release, which would be denied on September 20th of 2019. Carter's defense team would make futile attempts to petition her case to the U.S. Supreme Court with the argument based on the First and Fifth Amendment criteria. They claimed that Carter at the time was a juvenile that had broken no laws as well as her First Amendment right. That was their claim. However, the U.S. Supreme Court denied to hear the case. Carter would be released 3 months early on January 23rd of 2020 for good behavior. Per Massachusetts state law, it is allowed that an inmate can reduce their sentence by 10 days per month for exemplary behavior. Carter would serve 11 months and 12 days of her 15-month sentence. After her early release, Michele was placed on probation that was scheduled to end August 1st of 2022. As part of her probation, she was not allowed to profit from her story. Now that she is off probation, she is allowed to profit off of her story, and she has, from what I've been able to see, reached out to for her story, but she has been staying out of the spotlight from everything that I have read. The Captain Conrad Roy III Scholarship Fund at the Northeast Maritime Institute in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, was established in Conrad's memory. Nearly 8 years after Conrad took his own life, Conrad's mother, Lynn, spoke to People's Magazine, wanting to keep her son's memory alive. With this podcast, I want to help keep her son's memory alive as well, and also help make awareness to suicide prevention. Mental health is an endless battle that many people today deal with. If you or someone you know need help, someone to talk to, or have more than you feel that you can deal with, please call the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline by calling 988. You can also call the National Suicide Prevention Hotline at 1-800-273-8255. If calling isn't your thing and you feel more comfortable with texting, you're able to do so by texting the crisis text line by texting HOME to 741-741 anytime. Also, if you're struggling with mental health, don't struggle with it alone. Reach out to the show's sponsor, BetterHelp.com/CCC, and they'll be able to match you with a therapist who can help you with whatever you're dealing with. So where is Michele Carter now? That's up for debate, as we mentioned earlier, that she is staying out of the public spotlight since her release in 2020. Theories are that she has stayed with her parents in Plainville. She also hasn't publicly addressed the Hulu series, The Girl from Plainville, or the HBO 2-part documentary, I Love You, Now Die. That concludes this case at the campfire. I know there's more information that I didn't include in this story, as there is a lot of information to cover. All resources used to gather information for the case include, but not limited to, news articles, reports, documentaries, as well as other sources. I appreciate everyone who has gathered by the campfire with me for this case. I appreciate all the support from all the listeners and supporters. If you'd like to support the show, you can do so through the S'mores Fund at the website www.campfirecrimechronicles.com or through our PayPal directly, campfirecrimechronicles@gmail.com. There is going to be a bonfire bonus episode on Patreon, and whenever I have that established, I will let you guys know. Also, don't forget to rate the show 5 stars wherever you're listening, and shop at the merch store to get your Campfire Crime Chronicles merchandise. You can get hoodies, t-shirts, mugs, pens, even cooking aprons and bandanas for your pets at the merchandise store. Links will be provided in the show notes. So join me next time in 2 weeks as we gather around the campfire for the next case that we dive into. Remember to sleep with one eye open. This is the Campfire Crime Chronicles, a true crime podcast.